One of the experiences I trust every homebrewer shares is the feeling of awe that comes from witnessing the conversion of wort into beer through the fermentation process. Even after 15 years, I still get giddy when I see the first signs of airlock activity, a nice fluffy krausen developing on top of my beer. The worst is when this takes too long. You all know the anxiety that comes from checking on a batch a day after pitching and seeing no action. This is why we love Imperial Yeast, who pack 200 billion cells of the purest yeast into each pitch right pouch, which assures quick starts, healthy fermentation, and predictably great results. I strongly urge all of our listeners to check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and let them know that you appreciate their support of the Brewlosophy podcast while you're at it. All right, on to the show. In the beginning, beer tasted like, well, it tasted like beer with ingredients limited to malt, hops, yeast, and water. Nowadays, of course, one can find beers made with any number of interesting ingredients used to impart unique characteristics not found in more traditional versions of beer. Adjuncts like coffee. You're listening to the Brewlosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott. And in this episode, contributor Phil Rusher joins me to talk about some methods in which coffee is used in the brewing process.
That's right, Marshall. We're going to be talking about coffee and coffee and coffee today.
And coffee in beer, of course.
Yeah, I guess we can throw beer in there as well.
Coffee is one of those interesting ingredients to me because it does kind of emulate some of the characteristics of roasted malts, but of course it brings along its own unique characteristics as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes a lot of sense why brewers would want to use an adjunct like this, especially with more roasted or beer styles with more roasted grain. Yeah,
I've noticed that it tends to be mostly darker beers, though, in this day and age, there are some interesting concoctions with lighter beers being used, or coffee being used in lighter beers. Now, I'm thinking back over the hundreds of batches that I've brewed, and I'm pretty certain coffee is one of those ingredients I've never actually used in a beer that I've brewed. I like coffee. I actually like it quite a bit. It's just that I've never had a coffee beer that made me think, man, I wish I had a full keg of this on tap or whatever. Don't get me wrong. Some have been pretty good. Some of the beers that I've tried made with coffee have been pretty good. In fact, I don't think there's a local brewery who doesn't have a coffee beer kind of regularly on tap in their rotation.
Oh yeah, man. For sure. They're a staple these days. I think you should probably pull the trigger and just go for it.
Yeah, I might make like a 1 gallon. Seriously, my thing is for me to want to have 5 gallons around, it's got to be a beer that I actually want to drink over and over again.
For sure.
Yeah. So and one of the bigger issues that I've had with coffee beers is, and I don't know if it's the coffee or if it's some other part of the process, but every once in a while I'll get like a green pepper flavor. I know I've heard other people who claim to get that as well. But that is what the focus of this episode is on. We're going to get into a really interesting experiment that Phil, you did on this subject as well. Listen, if you're a regular listener of this show and would like to make sure that we're able to keep producing it, there are a few things you can do to support our efforts. First off, become a patron by visiting patreon.com/brewlosophy. It's a cool platform that allows us to give you some cool stuff in return for making a small monthly pledge. Rewards include things like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at Yakima Valley Hops, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session with someone in the brewing world. Coming up later this month is Lars Blog's Lars Marius Garschall, who, in addition to being an expert on European farmhouse brewing, is credited by many as introducing Kvik to the masses. I, for one, am really excited for this session. Lars is just a really great guy who we've been doing some consulting with. Past guests have included folks like John Palmer, Vinny Chilurzo, and John Kimmich, just to name a few. All past sessions are available on our private Facebook page, so patrons can go back and check those out whenever they like. Learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/brewlosophy. Another super easy way to support us is by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support. When you're doing your online shopping, your shopping experience isn't impacted at all, and we just get a little kickback that helps us to continue bringing you this show. Finally, please let us know what you think about this show, good, bad, or ugly, by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to your podcast. By doing so, not only do you make this show easier for people to find, but we get a kick out of reading your reviews as well. All right, feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who offer brewers a bunch of rad stainless equipment like the turnkey BH15 Pilot brewing system, which has a hard plumb manifold to eliminate all hosing changes during the brew process. Brewers Brewers Hardware also has a ton of unique purpose-built products useful to both professionals and homebrewers. Go see for yourself at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. Okay, so Stephanie Nelson wrote in to say, my husband and I commute to work together, and I love listening to your show. We've been brewing for a couple years and also read all of your experiments every week. That's awesome, Stephanie. She says his birthday is coming up, and I was going to get him some of those Brewlosophy glasses, but I can't find them anywhere. Are they for sale? And if so, where can I get some? All right, Stephanie, thank you for your feedback. It's awesome that you two listen to the show together and read the articles. You are certainly not the only person to want these glasses. In fact, it comes up almost daily. Unfortunately, we are a bit we're in kind of this impasse right now when it comes to merch. We do currently have t-shirts available at YakimaValleyHops.com, but that's it. We tried our hand at selling other stuff like the tasting glasses and whatnot, but it was a huge hassle. I am looking into other options. If people have ideas for how to get that done, go ahead and shoot me an email. I'd love to, I'll consider it. But for now, we don't have anything other than the t-shirts over at YakimaValleyHops.com. So, but again, keep your eyes peeled. I'll be sure to update everyone if we do find a different solution to that. Thanks for the feedback, Stephanie. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com. Leave us a voice message by calling 951-444-0320 or drop us a note on social media. All right, homebrewers do some weird stuff with beer. It's one of the cool things about this hobby. You can kind of experiment with ideas that you have in your head, see if it works out. And, you know, I guess if it doesn't, it's not a huge loss. Well, that's exactly what listener Jerry Wood did with a beer he calls Elvis's Lunch, an interesting concoction designed to emulate Elvis Presley's favorite bacon, peanut butter, and banana sandwich.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
Let me tell you something.
It's a caramelly color.
It's very cloudy.
It's the color of a guitar.
Good.
Oh, it's gonna be delicious.
It smells like leather. Smell it.
Oh, you know when you're in the airport and that guy's like cleaning or like he'll wax your shoes and you're like, I don't need my shoes waxed. Every once in a while in your life you'll do it. That's that smell.
It's not great. It tastes like it smells.
There's this style of beer that we discovered on this long journey. That this is that style. We don't like it. At one point, you said take everything in a garbage thing and like mix it in a blender. Like this is that style.
Yeah.
So whatever that style was, if we could just remember, that's what we'd say this is.
It's not good.
It's growing on me. It's growing on me.
I don't like it.
It tried to grow on me and I couldn't let it grow on me. So we're just two normal people. Would you order this in a bar? And if you got it, would you order another one?
No, I would not.
Me neither. I would not order a second one of this. Whoever made this, God, I love you. You're amazing. You do things we can't do. But normal people would not reorder your beer. I'm sorry.
I'll give him a 0.
Dude, I'm gonna go 5 because I know that this is a specific.
It's probably good at what it is.
You don't. I didn't mean that, Timmy. I love you. You know that.
I know.
There's a specific type of beer that this is, and I know that this is like this is a good beer of that type. It just isn't for us. That doesn't mean it's not good. So I'm going to give it 9 jerseys to offset your 0 Tims for a total of 69. Yeah.
All right. Experimentation is fun, but it doesn't always result in amazingness. Now, I don't know what Jerry thought of Elvis's Lunch, of his beer. And I have to believe he sort of got what he was aiming for with it. Just this kind of weird, unique, smoked bacon, peanut butter thing. I'm not a huge fan of smoked beers in general. I don't really like Hefeweizen in general. So maybe that's part of why my opinion is the way it is, but I was not a huge fan of this. I have to agree with the guys. It was just really odd. Jerry said that he fermented it with Hefeweizen yeast to get that banana character. He used smoked wheat to get that bacon character. Have you ever had anything like this, Phil?
I cannot say that I have, but I must say I love the idea. I think it's really creative. I don't really care for Elvis myself, but we all know that he is a debaucherous, or was a debaucherous man, and he loved him some fried peanut butter sandwiches. Yeah, man. I have to take my hat off to this. This is very creative.
Absolutely, the creative part of it is what's so neat about, I guess, homebrewing in general, but what Jerry did, it kind of reminds me of the stuff that Drew Beecham does. You know, he kind of thinks up these weird ideas and then puts them into a beer.
Yeah, he's a dude. He does that clam chowder thing, right?
Oh, Yeah.
Yeah.
But I will say that I liked Elvis's lunch a little bit better than that clam chowder beer that I've tried from Drew's. So kudos to you for being so creative, Jerry, and for being brave enough to send that beer in to get reviewed by these guys. We really do appreciate you sending it in. If you have a beer that you, or any other fermented beverage, in fact, that you want reviewed by Jersey and Tim, you can email me, Marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we will get you all set up. All right, when we come back, using coffee in beer. Stick around. So I've been hanging out with brewers and craft beer nerds for a long time now, and while we do occasionally have our differences, one thing it seems we all share is a love of learning and trying new things, as well as saving a couple of bucks. Well, right now, Craft Beer and Brewing is helping fans of Brewlosophy learn more while saving some coin by offering 20% off the price of a subscription to their awesome magazine. Chock full of brewing insights, tips, and recipes from industry experts, Craft Beer and Brewing is seriously great. I read every issue page to page myself. To get 20% off your subscription, all you have to do is sign up at beerandbrewing.com/brewlosophy. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the super fast counterflow chiller, the Exchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to Exchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. When dumping wort-soaked grain and leftover low-gravity wort while cleaning up after a brew day, did you ever wonder what your true efficiency would be if that wort made its way to the kettle instead? Using the brew bag, a fabric filter for all mash tuns and brewing methods, allows you to capture every last drop of wort. Not only does this increase kettle efficiency, it lowers your grain bill, which saves you money. Throwing wort in the trash is like dumping a 12-pack down the drain and just doesn't make sense. Use the brew bag and leave no wort behind. I've been using these filters for a long time and recommend them to everyone. I never have to worry about a stuck sparge and cleanup is fast and easy. Go grab yourself a brew bag fabric filter at brewinabag.com and be sure to use code TBP17 at checkout to get a discount on your order.
Just as the Grainfather all-in-one brewing system revolutionized all grain brewing at home, the Grainfather conical fermenter and glycol chiller take this one step further by giving homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation, just like commercial breweries use. With a full array of features including insulated double-walled construction, an innovative dual-valve yeast dump and sampling tap, and an integrated heating element and temperature controller, the conical fermenter provides a professional quality fermenting environment for superior temperature control. With the ability to individually power and control the temperature of up to 4 Grainfather conical fermenters, each with their own fermenting schedule, the Grainfather Glycol Chiller is the perfect addition to ensure superior fermenting results. And for a limited time, you can save 10% on your order by going to Grainfather.com and entering coupon code NZB during checkout. Once again, enter coupon code NZB when you order the Grainfather conical fermenter or Glycol Chiller at Grainfather.com. Once again, that's Grainfather.com.
As our regular listeners are likely very well aware, I have a pretty boring palate and strongly prefer beer-flavored beer. Because of this, I can't recall ever using coffee in my own brewing, though coffee beers are nearly impossible to avoid these days. Like I mentioned earlier, I think every single one of the local breweries around here has one on tap, or at least on their regular rotation. This just wasn't the case a while ago. It seems like this trend really has blown up over the last decade or so.
Yeah, absolutely. And for good reason, because coffee is delicious. And when you take delicious coffee and add it to delicious beer, one would assume that the result will also be delicious.
Yeah, hey, you know what? Delicious plus delicious usually does or can equal delicious. I would imagine so. Good point.
Good transitive property there. I don't know. I'm good at math.
Yeah. What's the? I honestly, I don't know if there is kind of a historical thing with using coffee and beer, but I'm sure it's not something that's only been done over the last 10 years. But I've noticed it just blowing up lately. It seems much more popular these days than it did when I got into drinking beer, craft beer, 20 years ago.
Yeah, and I think that just stems from, people being creative and getting bored with just doing the same thing over and over again. And I know from at least one of my favorite beers, the Carton Brewing's regular coffee was sort of imagined in that respect.
Sure.
But as far as coffee goes, like we're told that centuries ago in its origins, when we first started drinking, it was sometime around the 1500s or so. And we're told that there was some goat herder somewhere in Ethiopia who just noticed that his goats were eating this plant and they were just totally energized by this plant and they couldn't get him to sleep after that. And he told that to his local abbot, and his abbot went and made a drink from those berries. And he also was very energized and able to make it through his evening prayers and stuff like that. So from there, we're told that word spread out through the monastery and the community, and eventually we came to arrive at the beverage that we know and love today.
That wakes us all up, and we use I use coffee for multiple purposes, other than just enjoying the flavor. But it's my morning routine. So at some point though, people were like, "Hey, listen, we got this great coffee, like you said, Phil. You got this delicious beer. Let's put the two together and see what we can get." I wonder if anybody is credited with being kind of the first one, like the pioneer of coffee beer.
Oh, that is a really good question. I wish I knew the answer to that.
I'm trying to think of like the first coffee beer I ever had. I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, there was a beer that I think like Rogue from Portland or from Oregon put out, and that was quite a while ago, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, I want to say it was maybe like 10 or 12 years ago, 15 maybe.
Yeah, something like that.
Before my real drinking career started, I think.
Your career in drinking.
That's right.
I think what's interesting is the way that people use coffee and the purpose of using coffee in beer. Like we mentioned earlier, coffee is roasted, and a lot of grains that we use in brewing are roasted. Coffee is going to bring unique characteristics to beer that a lot of people really do feel pairs well with the characteristics of certain styles.
Absolutely. And it's really great for increasing the depth and nuance of any beer style, really. It just depends on what other flavors you want and are already there within the beer, but it's definitely a wide breadth of flavors you can experiment with.
Well, yeah, right. And I was reading something a couple weeks ago. I was in a conversation with somebody online about coffee and whatnot, and they forwarded me this article, and it was this person saying, you think about coffee beer, and you think about the way people talk about beer and the descriptors that we use, and there's this whole wide breadth of descriptors that we use to describe beer and ways that we experience it. But then when you throw coffee in it, you describe that coffee character as just being coffee. And this person's point was coffee on its own has this whole depth of descriptions as well. And all of those play a role when you're using coffee and beer, but we seem to kind of, mute most of that and just refer to it as coffee flavor.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that just has to do with the overall roasting process that is similar to roasting the grain. And you get a lot of those caramelization and Maillard reactions, stuff like that.
Right. And there's, I had a friend who was really big into coffee a long time ago. And he was, one of the things that he would always say is coffee is, so I'll never forget. He had this weird grinder that you had to I'm not a big coffee nerd, so I'll throw that out there now. But he had this weird box grinder thing that you had twisted this thing on the top, and it made it was like some special grind or whatever.
The burr grinder.
And a burr grinder, yeah, that's what it was. Yeah. But what was cool is as he's describing the characteristics of this special coffee bean that he got sent to him from some other country, I got what he was referring to. I mean, blueberry, that was a big thing that he was telling me, blueberry and all of these other things. And then he made me a cup of this coffee, and I can't help, but it's weird for me because every coffee beer I've ever had to this day, even as somebody who kind of geeks out on evaluating beer and whatnot, when I have a coffee beer, I need to break out of the cycle of just thinking of it as coffee, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It's the same thing with beer. As soon as somebody points out those different flavors and more subtle characters to you, you can't not notice them, and
right.
then it becomes this whole experience, and it's just lovely.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I'm not even, like I said, I don't even drink that much coffee beer, but as I really kind of think about the depth that can be added by using coffee and beer, it kind of opens my mind a little bit more to wanting to do this. What are some of the characteristics that are associated with coffee that you might experience in a coffee beer?
Well, it depends on the origin of the bean and the level of roast. I think those are the two main things there. I guess to take it from the top, you have two main varieties or species of coffee that's usually grown in the world. The first is Arabica, and the second is Robusta, with Arabica being like something on the order of 70% of the world's coffee is Arabica beans. And usually those beans are like lighter in body, a little bit less bitter, and also more lower acidity, whereas Robusta are a little bit heavier, a bit more bitter, and also have a little bit more caffeine, or so I'm told. And again, depending on where in the world those beans are grown, you're going to have different flavor characteristics. Like, for example, the coffee that comes from Southeast Asia is often Robusta, and so those tend to be more earthy, kind of herbal, more full-bodied. Whereas in Central America and Mexico, usually those are very well balanced, moderate acidity, sort of like an everyman's everyday coffee.
Yeah.
But I've had coffees from like even South America that taste like you said, blueberry, but then I get like this kind of yogurty character, and that sounds gross, but it's actually really nice.
I don't think that sounds gross, actually. That kind of sounds pleasant to me. When I think of yogurt, I just think kind of creamy, acidic,
Yeah, for sure.
Which for coffee kind of works. As we're talking about these flavor descriptors of coffee, it's interesting to me that I think the good majority of coffee beers out there are darker styles, which even when in our experimentation, if we use a stout or a porter for an experiment that we're doing, one of the first comments we'll get is, well, that's such a characterful beer, you're covering up any impact of the variable. It's interesting to me with how subtle and nuanced coffee characteristics can be that we have used coffee for the most part in these darker beers. Though, there are people who are using them. I think the beer that you're referring to, one of your favorite coffee beers, is a paler style, right? Yeah,
it's an imperial cream ale.
Yeah, that is so interesting.
Yeah, and actually it blends really nice.
I bet it does. That actually sounds pretty good. And we'll talk about the recipe that you did for your experiment, but it was inspired by this imperial cream ale, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's cool. Well, in the same way one of our contributors, Ray Found, huge coffee nerd, swears by certain ways of making his coffee, has a very, very fancy machine that he uses to make his coffee, all of this. And in the same way that the characteristic of the coffee can be influenced by the way in which it's treated, that's sort of the same, or people talk about the way the coffee is used in beer as having an impact, depending on where it's used in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for the most part, whenever you do adjuncts or like sort of flavor additions, you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck at making those additions after fermentation is completed.
That's kind of the common belief, right? That if you use it after fermentation, you're going to get more coffee character. I've read that, at least.
Yeah, and I think that's been the same in my experience. But that's not to say you don't get those characteristics prior to fermentation or at any point in between. It might just be different.
Well, and kind of on a practical level, when I think about coffee and beer, first thing my mind goes to is, well, the way we make coffee, and I'm not fancy schmancy coffee guy. I use a regular coffee machine, and you take the grounds and they sprinkle hot water over them. So in my head, using the coffee in the mash or the boil kind of seems logical, only because that's how I sort of think of coffee being made anyways?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good logical first step because, you just have a bunch of heat and you're extracting really quickly all those coffee flavors. So it's sort of like the quick and dirty, easy sanitation way to get those coffee flavors into your beer.
Of course, there are various other ways. We're not going to spend too much time talking about all of those because we want to focus on the variable that you tested in your experiment, which was adding coffee during the boil versus adding it in the fermentation vessel. But there are these different ways. One of the popular ones that you hear about now is adding actual coffee or the liquid coffee, so the extract, as opposed to the coffee grounds. I know people who will make a pot of coffee and you just toss that in, basically let it cool down a bit and let it toss that into the fermenting beer, or they'll cold steep. I've never done a cold steep. Can you kind of explain a little bit what that process is like?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very similar to making cold brew coffee, which for me, when I make cold brew coffee, which is usually relegated to late spring, summer months, but I do it in between as well. So you basically just take your ground up coffee and pour it in room temperature water, let it sit there for about 12, 16 hours, and then separate the grounds from the water. You can do that either just by lifting the grounds themselves with a bag or running it through a coffee filter. And then you have that extract, and that's usually very concentrated. So for purposes of making beer with that, I would absolutely just dump the entire thing into my keg or fermentation vessel or whatever. But if I'm drinking it, I could drink it straight that way if I want like really strong, robust flavors, or I could dilute it a little bit with some more water.
And anyone who has tried cold brewed coffee next to a cup of hot coffee, they are definitely different. At least that's been my experience. I really like cold brew coffee as well. I've never made it myself, but they definitely are different. Another consideration when brewing with coffee is how to add it. If you're going to add the beans, do you grind it? If you're going to grind it, is it a fine grind? Is it coarse? Do you just add the whole beans?
For practicality purposes and not running the risk of getting clogs, I would err on the side of doing more of a coarse grind if I'm going to grind it up. And I think I do prefer grinding the coffee just because time is money. And when you grind up those coffee beans, you're going to have an increased surface area with which the beans interact with the water. So less time you needed to extract those flavors, and then
right,
you'd be fine.
Yeah, there was a small nano brewery a while back. They posted a picture on Instagram. And I remember they were just adding whole beans in bags to a batch of coffee beer that they were making, and when they pulled it out, the beans, I mean, you can tell extraction had occurred. These beans just looked so different.
Yeah, well, I think if anything, they might swell up a little bit. They're kind of absorbing the water or the beer at that point.
And they lose a little bit of color, which is interesting because I don't know if they're losing color in the expansion process. They just look like they're kind of more pale. But
right.
What's weird is that you can use coffee and it doesn't really impart color in the way that you would expect it to, based on the color of a pot of coffee. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's interesting. And I wonder the difference between that and using like roasted grains for just steeping purposes, because that usually imparts some sort of color to the wort, right? It's not necessarily the case, or at least not as obvious a case with coffee.
Right. It's kind of the same thing with like cacao nibs. People are, you expect it to turn out kind of a brownish color, but it really doesn't have that huge of an impact. So I'm with you. If I'm going to make a coffee beer, I'm going to coarse grind the coffee beans and then probably toss those in a brew bag or something like that, just to make them easier to get out and to avoid potential clogs. Sure. Another thing to think about when you're using coffee and beer is the point at which you introduce the actual coffee in the process. And this is what brings us again to the main topic of this show. One place where some people will add coffee is in the mash. And my understanding is, again, it's kind of that thought that you make coffee by steeping it in warm water. Might as well add some coffee grounds to the mash as well. I don't know if there are any thoughts or opinions about how that using coffee in that way might impact the character of the beer.
Well, as with most things in homebrewing, especially, there's always thoughts and opinions about the best way to do things.
Yes, there are.
But I've never played around with the mash coffee thing, and it kind of seems interesting to me because when I'm making coffee, usually I steep the grounds at like 205 degrees Fahrenheit, or whatever that is in Celsius, maybe like 95 Celsius, I think, which is significantly hotter than what the mash is. But you're also in the mash, you have a much longer period of time in which you're steeping. So
Right.
I think that would work out well. And I think with green tea, you're supposed to use like around that mash temperature level water. So like that makes a lot of intuitive sense to me. Like you would want to extract those flavors at a similar temperature there.
Yeah, I to me, it makes kind of intuitive sense. But again, people aren't. I don't think that's the most popular way people are using coffee in their beer. Rather, very common point of introduction is during the boil.
Yeah, for sure.
Just to kind of briefly overview, if you're going to use it in the boil, I think what most people, at least what I've seen in my research of this, what most people do is they'll add however much coffee they're going to add, something like maybe 3 ounces, which is like 90 grams ish, maybe with 10 to 15 minutes left in the boil.
Yeah, and I think less is more there because usually when you do a lot of big coffee additions in a boil at really hot temperatures like that, you end up extracting a lot of those more bitter compounds.
Well, and so then that's an interesting thing as well, because one of the things about cold steeping that I've heard is that you get a much smoother, it's just as strong, if not even a little bit stronger, but you get a much smoother, less bitter coffee. It makes sense to me that by adding the grounds directly to the boil, that hot boil, and that you might actually, it could lead to a more, not an unpleasant bitterness, but kind of a sharper, maybe more noticeable, bitterness.
Yeah, and I think that might be resulting from. We can speculate about this all goddamn day, but I would say it might be the cellulose content of the beans themselves.
I would have no idea if that's what it is or not. But another place that people, another way I guess that coffee is used is what we'll refer to as dry beaning. It's basically like a dry hop, right? Where you'll take the grounds, you'll take the beans, or even the liquid, the extract of the coffee, and add it during fermentation, usually towards the end, in the same way that you would a dry hop.
Yes, exactly like you mentioned before with the brewery, just dumping in those bags of beans into their fermentation vessel. That's one of the most popular ways, I think.
Yeah. That's seems to be the most common one that I'm seeing nowadays. I think a lot of people, and they, what I'm hearing about that method, again, this is conjecture because I've never brewed like this, is that it does lead to, or people tend to think that it leads to a smoother coffee flavor, that it doesn't really play around, it doesn't interact with the bitterness of the beer as much, and so it's in many ways, I guess you could say it's more controllable. You've used a couple of these methods. What are your thoughts before we get into the experiment? What are your thoughts on boiling, adding it during the boil, adding it during the firm vessel? Is there one that you've tended to prefer?
Yeah, I'm definitely of the opinion that post-boil additions are the way to go for most things for me.
Would you say that in your experience that it does kind of lend a smoother coffee flavor? Is it go along with that whole idea, or is there other stuff that you get from it as well?
Yeah, no, I think it definitely becomes a bit smoother doing the post-boil addition, and I think that you get a more a deeper variety of coffee flavors that way. I think some of that gets lost maybe in the boil and maybe in the cooling process of the wort. And overall, I think it just is less bitter, more sweet, and a bit fuller coffee flavor than adding it during the boil.
Yeah. I wonder if I've got to imagine that big coffee beer brewers out there have messed around with multiple coffee additions. So maybe adding coffee in the mash during the boil, and then, dry beaning their coffee as well, just to really amplify that coffee character.
Yeah, I'm not certain that it would get amplified. I kind of feel as though it might be wasteful, because you can get most of those flavors just by doing it on the back end. But, who knows? I mean, I've never done a comparison where you do 1, 2, or like a combination of any of those.
Yeah. Sort of like there's a saturation point or something. You hear that talked about, like Shellhammer talks about that with dry hopping, that there's this point where you've used enough hops that you're gonna get all of the hop character that you want. Now you're just throwing hops at it for fun and not getting anything else out of it. Perhaps that is the case with coffee as well.
Being able to say that you dry hopped the crap out of this thing, like that might be true, but whether or not you can, taste the difference in it,
yeah,
whatever.
No, I know, but we like to say that we've used a lot of stuff for our beer, so I get where that's coming from.
More is more.
Well, yeah, exactly. So is it common for people to experience coffee in beer as having sort of like a green pepper? And by that, what I'm talking about is like the flesh, not the heat, but like the flesh of a jalapeno or of like a green bell pepper. I've had so many coffee beers where that's what I taste, and it makes me wonder if I'm alone in that, or if it is an actual thing.
No, you are certainly not alone with that. I've tasted that myself, and I even did taste that in the coffee beers that I made for this experiment. And I think that has more to do with an oxidation process than anything else.
Interesting. Oh.
But, I haven't done any actual studies on that, so who knows?
It's interesting. I have had coffee beers that have zero of that character as well. I do tend to prefer the coffee beers that don't taste like that.
I wonder if you remember when you did taste those green pepper flavors, was it on draft or was it in a bottle or what?
It has happened so many times that I couldn't. I've had it on draft. I've had it out of a can, out of bottles. It's just this. It's a weird thing that I've gotten from some coffee beers, and it's weird because I'll have, for example, this was about 2 years ago. One of my favorite local breweries has a coffee beer that they, again, it's in their regular rotation, and it's a pretty good one. And I ordered a just sample of it, and it tasted like green pepper. The next batch of it didn't taste like green pepper. So, in my head, I'm going, God, they've got their process down. They're very consistent with their beers. How can one? I thought maybe it was a different coffee bean or a different roast or something like that. But oxidation seems like a curious kind of theory about where that's coming from.
Yeah, it seems like to me at least to be the most obvious reason why. Because I can't think of there's a lot of flavor characters in coffee for sure, but green pepper is not usually among them. So yeah, and I've only tasted that in beer. I have never had a coffee just taste like green pepper.
No, that's a good point. Either have I. But for some reason, when it gets used in beer, sometimes it does that. It's something to explore further. Well, like we discussed, there are various methods a brewer might use to impart coffee flavor into their beer, a couple of which you put to the test. Phil, results from that experiment when we return from this break. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD, that's BRUPOD, at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you.
Hi, I'm Stephen Leach, creator of Brow Supply Brewing Systems, here to tell you about our latest Unibrow brewing system. Modeled after the brew in a bag method, the Unibrow uses the same kettle for both mashing and boiling, replacing the fabric bag with a stainless basket that can hold up to 20 pounds of grain. A heating element is run by an electric controller that allows for the maintenance of specific mash temperatures and makes mashing easier than ever. Each Unibrow is shipped with a counterflow chiller and the parts required to brew a batch of beer. We're really proud of the Unibrow, and we know you'll love it as much as we do. Go check it out at browsupply.com and sign up for our email list to receive special deals in your inbox.
Similar to the beliefs surrounding hop additions, there exist numerous claims about the character extracted from coffee based on the point in the process in which it's added. Phil, as someone who enjoys coffee beer, you tested it out to see for yourself.
That's right. So what I did was I wanted to test whether or not we can perceive a difference in two coffee beers. One of them had coffee added during the boil, and the other one was added after fermentation in the fermentation vessel.
Now, as we kind of discussed before, you sort of had some opinions prior to performing this experiment. You'd kind of preferred the later additions, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I think you get a more robust upfront coffee flavor and aroma from using it later versus earlier in the process.
Yeah. So for this one, again, you were inspired by a Imperial cream ale, which I still to this day think it's just really interesting style, but it works so well for this. You kind of get the, people say, oh, cream ale's not really creamy. Well, in this one, it kind of is. So
in this one, it was mostly because I also used lactose in this beer, because that was also in homage to this commercial beer that I so enjoyed.
Yeah. So you made 2 5-gallon batches of this cream ale. Tell us a little bit about the recipe.
So the recipe was 83% Pilsner malt, 13% flaked maize, and 4% lactose. That's basically just the standard cream ale recipe for me, plus a little bit of lactose to make it that coffee and cream ale.
Yeah, there you go.
And from there, so we mashed at 152 Fahrenheit or 67 Celsius for 60 minutes. After that point, there was a sparge, and then we boiled each batch for 60 minutes. And the one batch that received 3 ounces of freshly coarse ground coffee, or 85 grams, at 3 minutes left in the boil, while the other one was left alone. And for the grinding, I used my burr grinder because I am a pseudo coffee nerd. I wouldn't call myself on the Ray level of coffee nerd, but maybe approaching that. So that was like the second to highest coarse ground I could get. And then from there, I just cooled it down as fast as I could using the counterflow chiller with the Grainfather. And then they were fermented out for about 2 weeks using a 18 joystick. So after I confirmed final gravity on each of them, curiously, the beer that had the coffee added during the boil was about 3 gravity points higher than the one that did not receive it in the boil.
Yeah, I don't think that's a huge, again, 0.003 specific gravity points isn't crazy to me. These beers did start off pretty high. It's an Imperial cream ale, so there was 1060 OG, and they fermented down to the one with the coffee and the boil fermented down to 1027. The other one was 1024, but it had not had the coffee added yet when you took that hydrometer reading, right?
That's correct. Yeah, and I think that's within reason, like you said. I confirmed the final gravity there, and I added the next batch of 3 ounces or 85 grams of coarse ground coffee to the fermentation vessel with the lower gravity. And it sat there for 12 hours. And that was also, sorry, I should have mentioned. So after I confirmed the final gravity, I cold crashed down to about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, whatever that is in Celsius. I'm sorry, everybody, I don't know what that is.
It's about 4 degrees Celsius.
So it sat there for about a day, and at that point, I added the ground beans.
So you added the grounds, went into the cold beer. So this really was kind of we really were testing differences. I mean, boil, you got the hot coffee added to this hot boiling wort. The other one, you're cooling the beer down. Or did you add the coffee during the cold crash, or was it once the beer was already cold?
Yeah, it was after it was already cold. So we're basically cold extracting the coffee, cold brew coffee via beer, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
So after that, I proceeded with kegging the beers. Luckily, so I didn't add any bags or anything with that fermentation vessel beer, which was ballsy. In hindsight, I think I would recommend people using bags, but luckily it did not clog. And
God.
From there, I kegged up the beers, burst carbonated, and then let them sit for a couple weeks before pulling samples and serving to participants.
Now, you pulled these, you pulled samples of these beers, and you can go check out the pictures in the article over at brewlosophy.com. But I sort of thought, again, my presumption, just based on the fact that you were throwing coffee grounds into hot boiling wort, I sort of thought that might extract a little bit more color and maybe lead to a darker beer than the one that you added the coffee to it in the fermentation vessel. To my eyes, these beers look completely identical.
Yeah, I agree. They were totally identical in every way in appearance. Foam, no color differences. Everything was the same as far as looks are concerned.
So you take these beers and you did a couple of triangle tests yourself. Tell us about your experience with these beers in the triangle test. They looked identical, but did they taste identical?
They did not. So I had my darling wife serve me some of these beers in my semi-blind capacity, and right away, I'd always the most immediate thing for me was the aroma. The aroma on the Boil Edition beer was much more muted, the coffee aroma, that is. And the flavors were there as well, but also muted. But there was also much more harsh in its bitterness. And and with the other beer was more well-rounded, both in terms of the coffee blending with the base beer. And like I said, it was more pronounced with its coffee flavor and aroma.
So it sort of confirmed what you had already what you expected, in essence.
Yeah, exactly. And it was not hard for me to tell these beers apart.
This is before we get into the actual experiment results. Was the outcome of the coffee and cream ale beer good? Did it taste like coffee and cream? I think a lot of people are going to be wondering because it sounds like a fun idea.
It is. Yeah, it is a fun idea. Actually, I think if I were to make this beer again, I would dial up the coffee and dial back just slightly the lactose, because I felt like it was very sweet. But yeah, it was almost like coffee and cream, but not quite.
And I would think that maybe adding some vanilla would probably maybe amplify that cream part of it. Anyways, you served this beer to 28 participants, out of which 15 would have needed to identify the odd beer out in order for us to say that it was significant. And in the end, 61% of people, or 17 tasters, identified the unique sample, which tells us that these beers were pretty perceptibly different.
Yeah. So statistics would have told us that maybe what's a third of 28? I don't know. We can't do math.
Oh, yeah, 9.
Yeah, so we would have expected 9 people to say, just by random chance, getting it right. But we had not quite double that, maybe 150% of that. So I think that is a really good example of how different these beers really were.
Absolutely. I mean, 17 out of 28 people able to identify the odd beer. It says to me, I'm comfortable saying at the very least that by adding coffee into the boil, you're going to get a different outcome. You're going to get a different character than if you add coffee towards the end of fermentation in the fermentation vessel.
Right.
Of course, whenever we have a significant result, people want to know what tasters prefer.
Yeah. And this one very much like a lot of our tests, I think it seems like, but it was pretty much split down the middle. And I think this again is just more subjectivity than anything. We like what we like, Yeah. So for this one, it looks like 7 preferred the coffee in the boil, 8 people liked coffee in the firm vessel, and 2 people who got it correct had no preference, despite noticing a difference.
Yeah. So split preference, which again screams to me, try both out for yourself and make up your mind based on what you like. Ultimately, these results suggest that beers made with coffee again in the boil are perceptibly different than those made with coffee added to the beer in the fermentation vessel. And again, it doesn't speak to which one is better. So try it out for yourself. Any other thoughts on this experiment before we get to some reader comments?
Yeah, no, I want to hammer this home, I guess. Like, we go experiment for yourself, go try this out. And I'm actually really interested in trying to see what any, if any, potential differences would be if we use, coffee in the mash and in the boil kettle and in the fermentation vessel, or some combination thereof. That sounds like a lot of fun to me. Go do it.
I also kind of want to do take some like ground up base malt and put it in my coffee maker. Kind of the opposite direction. Just see what happens with that. I'd think that it would, convert if it's not too hot. But anyways,
it would, but it would also taste like shit, I think, because of all the coffee.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, all the stuff that's run through my machine.
Yep.
That's a good point. All right, well, let's get to some reader comments here. JC said, "What was the process of adding the ground coffee post fermentation?" I think you already went over that, but then he asks, "Are any worries about contamination?"
Absolutely, yeah. So at any point in time, if you're at making additions to your beer after it's fermented, you're susceptible to, or after it's boiled rather, you're susceptible to infection or something else bad happening.
Right.
So for me, I just sort of ran the risk and did it. Luckily, like, coffee itself is pretty dry, right? It's been roasted, and it's hopefully in a vacuum sealed container with nominal amounts of intrusion.
Yeah.
That, and like the low pH of beer and the alcohol itself is also going to make it less prone to something bad happening, but you are going to run that risk.
Yeah, I was wondering, like, the person who is absolutely neurotic and terrified of contaminating their beer, could you do the thing? I mean, I know you can, where you maybe make a tincture or soak the coffee in vodka and then just add all of that. It sounds to me, what I'm seeing when people are making firm vessel additions is they're basically what you did. They're just kind of, throwing caution to the wind, trying to be as clean as possible and adding it. But there are various workarounds for people who are worried a bit more about that. So,
absolutely. Yeah. And actually one time I cold brewed coffee with, I say that with air quotes. I cold brewed coffee with vodka and added that to a beer, and it was so good.
That's awesome.
Yes.
All right. Next comment comes from Jim. He says, "My thought was that good coffee is made with water in the 170 degree Fahrenheit range, not boiling. We do brew in a bag brewing, and I'm wondering if we could just add grounds to the 150 degree mash and get a milder pull from the coffee. Just not sure what the boil would do to the flavor if the grounds are removed with the bag of grains. I'd love to see that as another variable."
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you just said. I think when you do those mash additions, or early on the boil maybe, a lot of those things might volatilize, and you might lose some of those flavors and aromas. But it would be interesting to see.
Yeah, I'm the more I think about using coffee earlier in the process, it's less. I guess my thinking, again, total presumption here, but it's less about where the coffee's used in the heat and whatnot, as it is about the amount of time that coffee spends in that warmer environment, and then kind of how much it gets abused. I mean, if you're using it in the mash, you've now got, basically hot, grounds in a hot environment. Then you move it onto the boil, and it boils, and then, it goes through the chilling process, and it goes through all that stuff. I just wonder if maybe that's not where some of the odd flavors that I've experienced might be coming from. I really don't know. I'm curious to see if mash additions, what kind of an impact that has as well, Jim. So,
agreed.
Next comment comes from Reddit user Zinger565, who says, "A few of us in our homebrew club have noticed the pepper-like flavor becomes more pronounced when the coffee gets oxidized." Hey, you mentioned this earlier, Phil. Since the coffee was added at the end of the boil, it was probably oxidized for yeast pitch, hence the slight pepper-like flavor that you noticed, Phil. It's a tough thing to avoid, especially if you want to add cold brew coffee to a finished beer.
Yeah, I think it's possible. But I think also if you're adding it when there is yeast present and they're doing their work, most of that oxygen is going to be scavenged at that point. For me, like I know a few of the people who I was talking with when they tasted these beers had noticed that green pepper flavor. And I think, if anything, they probably picked up some oxygen during the packaging process.
Right.
Yeah, so I think that might be more of a culprit there than oxygen in the fermentation vessel.
oxidation is a real thing. Things oxidize.
For sure.
And so when I think about the potential impact oxidation has with coffee beers, there's so many things you have to consider, because it could be that the coffee prior to even using it in the beer is already oxidized in some way. Yeah. It could be that the preparation, the way that the coffee is prepped for use in the beer, at that point the coffee gets oxidized. It could be that once you add that coffee to the beer, that the typical oxidation, like you mentioned during packaging or whatever else, that it reacts differently because of the coffee in the beer. There's just so many different points at which it could be that. It does seem to me, based on what Zinger 565 is saying and what you were kind of talking about before, that oxygen could very well be the culprit for this odd pepper flavor that I've gotten in coffee beers.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I would be hesitant to say it's any one of those things. And if you are getting those flavors, it's probably some combination of them in reality, but who knows what it is exactly.
Yeah. And like you were mentioning, there's certain coffee varieties that are just more earthy, and it could be that certain coffee varieties also have you run the risk of imparting that flavor just by using that specific coffee or whatever. Who knows?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I would be interested to see how this would turn out if I had used like a craft coffee roaster, because all I used was, my local grocery store's brand. And
right.
I don't know where that's been and how it's been stored and all that stuff. So I would be very interested to see how that would turn out if it were, a little bit smaller scale.
No, I totally agree. Actually, somebody proposed I think it was because of this experiment, or maybe one of our other coffee experiments, but somebody proposed doing a coffee comparison where you'd throw something like Folgers at a beer and then use a really, nice craft roasted, coffee as well in the other one. That'd be kind of interesting.
Would be interesting.
So next comment comes from Reddit user Putnam Brew and Barbecue, who said, I really thought it would change the color of the beer much more. I've been contemplating making a golden stout, but thought that the coffee would sure enough change the color to at least a dark amber. This is a comment, again, I've seen a lot. People are afraid. It's weird because golden stout is a golden stout because of coffee. And so, but coffee does not, like we mentioned earlier, seem to impart much color at all.
Yeah, it's one of those counterintuitive things where you think one thing's going to happen, but total opposite in result. It's really interesting. I do wonder, again, if we were using like a super dark roast. I used a dark roast, but again, I don't know what their roasting level was like exactly. So I am curious to see if I had used like a really dark French roast, say, in this beer. But yeah.
And for those who are wondering, golden stout, or I think some people call it a white stout, is basically, imagine your typical grist for a stout minus all of the roasted malts. And then I think most people will add, they add coffee to get that roasted character to kind of emulate the roast that you might get from a roasted malt. But most people are also adding some cacao nibs and maybe a little bit of vanilla. I think.
Yeah, for sure. And I think some people also use some like flaked barley and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah. Again, pretty similar to a typical stout grist, just with stuff to fake it, basically. Stout. So, all right. Next comment comes from Scott Pintabone, I think is how you say it. He says, most important question. How did the beers taste? Carton's regular coffee and other variants are awesome.
No, these tasted good. I wouldn't say they're the same as regular coffee, but very, very nice. The regular coffee is something like 12% alcohol. Mine was like 4.5%, 5%. I can't remember. So not exactly regular coffee, but definitely drinkable beer. I wasn't sad to have 10 gallons in my Keezer.
Yeah, that's always the best when you make these experiment beers and you actually enjoy them,
Exactly, yeah.
What did you think of that? I was curious about this. I haven't used Imperial's joystick. What'd you think of that yeast?
Oh, I'm a fan. I think it's one of the unsung heroes. I think some people have, whatever bad feelings toward that strain of yeast, but I think it works well in a variety of styles. And I think, especially fermented on the lower end here, I didn't get any ester character. One could say that, a lot of the coffee and lactose, everything else covered it up, but I've used it in other styles at the lower end and I had totally clean. Big fan.
Awesome. And just to clarify, joystick is what others might refer to as Pac-Man. I believe it's originally sourced from Rogue. So that's and that was your comment about some people not being a big fan of that strain. I've not used it. I have some in my fridge. I picked some up. I also recently, this is complete tangent, but I just had a beer we fermented with Independence Ale, which I think is Anchor. That was sourced from Anchor's like Anchor Liberty. Awesome strain, by the way. Just
I've never
put
used
that
it.
out there. Yeah,
I've got some too. I'm looking forward to doing it myself.
Yeah, nice clean strain. All right, final comment comes from Caleb, who says, I actually work in coffee professionally and have participated in a number of collaborations with beer brewers here in New York City. In my opinion, the best results come from adding cold brew coffee concentrate to the finished fermented beer. That way you can also make test mixes and decide how much coffee flavor you'd like to impart. If you ever do a follow-up to this interesting study, I'd love to see if there are any data you can gather about using cold brew. Well, we actually have done a cold brew versus hot brew coffee experiment. That's for another show. But I thought this was a good comment that adding cold brew, in this person's opinion, works even better potentially than adding grounds to the fermentation vessel.
Yeah, and I've had a similar conversation with the guy I buy coffee from at work. He's craft roaster down in Ithaca. And he basically said the exact same thing, unsolicited, of course.
Well, it's interesting to me because I would think that by adding coffee grounds or even whole coffee beans, that you are going to impart a richer, more pungent coffee character, as opposed to adding the extract of after steeping or whatever it is, cold brewing coffee. That to me seems like it would be I guess less concentrated, but what it sounds like Caleb here and others have experienced is that it actually imparts more coffee flavor.
Right, exactly. So part of that has to do with the time it takes, because you're usually cold brewing for 12 to sometimes 24 hours.
Sure.
So having that much more time with the water in contact with the coffee, you're going to get a lot more flavors and a lot more depth of flavor as well.
Right. That's awesome. Well, I think I'm going to go pour myself a second cup of coffee here. Phil, is there any last thoughts on using coffee in beer?
Again, go forth and do it.
Are you telling me to do it or our listeners? Because
do it.
All right, man. Well, that's all the time we've got for this episode. Don't forget to head over to brewlosophy.com to read up on the experiment discussed in this show, as well as everything else we're up to. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.